I can walk a bit. Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you again. I'm grateful you are giving your time to listen to me today. As Dr. Sandell said, I'm speaking towards and about the particular microcultures that make up my cultural identity. And just as a review, some microcultures are the generation that you're born into, your age, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, language, geography, citizenship, so on and so forth. And it is, if you take each one of these microcultures, and if each one of them is a separate circle, and you create a Venn diagram with them, the part where all those circles overlap is your cultural identity. So it's all these small parts of me that define me, then create what my cultural identity is. And the reason I'm here to speak is because I'm much older, and I have a lot of experience. I have experienced a lot of different changes in microcultures. And I read out of the textbook, I just wanted to bring context. It says, this influence, the cultural influence may change over time, and is greatly influenced by our life experiences. We shed aspects of our culture that no longer have meaning, and we adopt or adapt aspects of other cultures that were not inherent in our upbringing. So what I'm going to start with, I'll start with my upbringing, and I'll just describe the microcultures that I'm a part of, and then I'll talk about the changes that have occurred that have created a change in my cultural identity. So I was born here in Mankato, Minnesota. Both my parents are white, middle class in the 60s and 70s. My dad had a good paying job. My mother worked on and off outside the home. I was a bus kid, which means I lived outside of Mankato, but it was not a farm, so I wasn't a farm kid technically. I went to public school here in Mankato. I graduated from Mankato West High School. Growing up, had everything we needed, more or less. You know, we had family vacations and everything. I always had clothes, and I was able to participate in band and sports. So socioeconomically, we were comfortable. I have one sister, an older sister. I was raised in a Lutheran church here in Mankato. And once I was confirmed around age 14, I did leave that church. And as I move forward through the story, I'll tell you the different iterations of spirituality, religion that I then found myself in. Mankato in the 60s and 70s was pretty homogenous. There was not any what we could call diversity. This is prior to some of the two major influxes of other populations, other ethnic or racial ethnic populations, was the Hmong population in the late 70s after the Vietnam War, and then the Somali population in the 90s. So prior to that, the only diversity in Mankato really was here on campus with international students. So it's very, as a young man, I did not notice any diversity until I was, I think, a sophomore in high school. One black student from Minneapolis was a transfer to Mankato. And so that was the first time I met somebody outside of my own ethnic and racial background, but I'm going to talk about race a little bit later on. I graduated, moved out on my own, and then within 6 months moved back because I spent all my money on weed and partying and didn't pay my bills. So my socioeconomic status has varied throughout my life. I have had some really good paying jobs. I've also had jobs that I did because of the value of the position as opposed to the pay. And now I'm a graduate student, so you know where I'm at socioeconomically now. I'm probably one of the oldest graduate students on campus, and I'm actually very proud of that fact. I went into the military in 1979, and this was my first immersion among people that were truly different from me. And I mean that because they came from different areas of the country, so geographic differences. They came from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. We were all pretty much the same age. There was certainly varying socioeconomic backgrounds. A lot of times people have the belief that poor people go in the military, and that is somewhat substantiated. But you know, I wasn't obviously poor, but I don't want up in the military anyway. So coming from my homogenous background here in Midwestern Mankato, to all of a sudden the guy sleeping in the bunk above me is from inner city Detroit, I believe. I can't remember his name, but I do remember his face. And the stories and the things that experiences that he could relate were vastly different than mine, because I didn't grow up in a large city. He was black, I was white. We had different education because of the different socioeconomic and cultural things within these different areas. So I got to learn about different people's backgrounds, and things that I thought were pretty generalized weren't. There's a lot of there's a multiplicity. You know, the textbook has said, you know, a multicultural classroom in a pluralistic society. I mean, there's a lot of cultural backgrounds, and as educators, you need to know that not everybody's culture has the same background and basis as ours. And again, as I move forward to this story, you'll see how I've experienced that. One thing that it really stuck out for me, because coming from our own cultural background, we have a way of looking at the world and seeing and believing about things. And when we run up against folks that are different from us, geographically, age, ethnically, and all this, we learn. And we learn things that are sometimes surprising to us. And so one thing that I learned, we were out on a firing range in the military. This is in Alabama in the summertime. And I'm getting burnt. And I'm complaining about it. And there was a black guy next to me, and I was, you know, talking about this, and I made an ignorant remark saying, you know, you don't have to worry about this. And he pulled up his sleeve to show me that yes, he was colored differently from the exposure to the sun and with the part that was covered by his shirt. And that sunburn and sun exposure was a real concern. And that, I mean, it sounds kind of stupid now, but it was a real learning thing for me. That, because I didn't have to experience it, I never was confronted with this before, to then have to realize that my preconceptions, my preconceived notions might not always be correct, which is a great thing to learn, especially at an early age, is that our preconceived notions that we learn from our own cultural bias and such cannot be generalized, and we need to be able to assimilate these other things. Got married while I was in the military, had 2 children, got an associate's degree. Returned to Mankato, was a student, undergraduate student here, got divorced. Moved into the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area in 1987 and remained there until 2004. While I was there, I was in the hospitality industry. I eventually wound up running a nightclub in downtown Minneapolis that was owned by Prince, the musician. So here's another microculture influence. I was among the high rollers. I met Donald Trump. I used to hang out with Prince. I used to, the celebrities of the 90s, which I won't mention because most of you won't know a lot of who they are. Everybody remember Madonna? I used that as a reference in a class one time, and people are like, who? At one point in downtown Minneapolis, I could not, now I made a healthy salary at this job, but at one point I could not spend any money in downtown Minneapolis because I was popular. I ran this really hot new nightclub owned by Prince, and so I would go to other places, and they would immediately usher my party and I in the door. And the bartenders would throw me drinks for free. The only money I spent was to tip people. So here's a part of a culture that is far removed from the kid from the farm town of Mankato. You know, I was in the middle of culturally centered, popular cultural center of Minneapolis for a number of years, music-wise and entertainment-wise. It was that point when I left that job in my early 30s that I had sort of an existential crisis, renaissance, if you will, where I abruptly changed a number of things. I started working with people with disabilities in adventure education. I moved into a position of teaching high school at an inner city school in Minneapolis, working with predominantly gang kids. I wound up both in the Minneapolis area and then later when I moved to Colorado doing adventure education, outdoor education in the mountains, taking people into the wilderness. Eventually now I made my way back here in education and getting some master's degrees around education and different things. But when in my early 30s, now I told you that I was brought up in a Lutheran church and I left that church. And I left the idea of organized religion. So in my early 30s I had this desire to find some sort of spiritual belonging. Growing up in Mankato, and I'll digress a moment, does everybody know what happened in Mankato historically around American Indians? Okay, so the mass execution, the Dakota conflict. So I grew up with that knowledge somewhat. We were taught about the Sioux Massacre, which is predominant, what we call a dominant narrative. Okay, now we know it as the Dakota conflict, which is incorporating more aspects of the Dakota side of things, which is at the heart of my current thesis research, is dominant narratives and counter narratives when it comes to basically white Eurocentric history and American Indian history and how they collide and contrast and compare. So in my early 30s, I had this, wanted to have the spiritual awakening, only had grounding in Christianity, and I was working at a program, adventure program, and I had students come in from an alternative school that all had diagnoses of ADD, ADHD, and they wouldn't listen to each other and couldn't get along. So I created an object, a talking stick. Basically, the object says if you have the stick in your hand, you can talk. If you don't have the stick in your hand, you have to be quiet and you listen. And this worked very well as a strategy with this particular group. This is somewhat considered a Native American, which is I prefer American Indian. They say it's an American Indian idea. I'm not sure the American Indians all agree with that. Sorry, I just moved out of the video. But the leader of this group commented on that, and that it worked very well. And he said, do you have an interest in Native American spiritual things? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, he invited me to my first ceremony. This was in 1995. And so in May of that year, I went to my first Lakota sweat lodge. And I knew I was home. I knew that this was something that I really wanted to do and be a part of. And so that year, I went out to Rosebud, South Dakota, which is the place for the Rosebud Sioux tribe, which that's what the government calls them. They know themselves, they call themselves as the Sichangu Lakota. And I started going out, initially going out for ceremonies and things that would happen on an annual basis. Then I started going out more throughout the year and staying with different families and becoming a part of the community. I have seen children born, I have helped bury people. I'm there for their successes and their failures. I have been intimately involved in the culture. In 2009? No. Anyway, in around 2010 probably, I was adopted into a family. And so I have relatives that are American Indians, specifically Sichangu Lakota. Now, this adoption ceremony was not because I don't have my own parents, my own family. My parents still live here in Mankato, and I'm still involved with them. But the idea of the adoption ceremony in Lakota culture is there is someone who is a benefit to your family and has shown the respect and knowledge and the passion to be involved intimately with your family, and so they make you a relative. They make it official. And so a man, his name is Albert Whitehat, he's passed on now, adopted me. And so immediately I gained, all of his relatives became my relatives. So I have a number of brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles, people I have never even met. But within the community, I'm known by probably several hundred people. And they know my position. In Lakota culture, identifying and relating to each other by name is not as important as relating to each other by how you're related. And that comes out of a close culture that was originally nomadic and smaller. If the group got too big, they would split off and form two different groups, because that was essential for the nomadic way of life. And so having these intimate relationships required you to understand your relationship with them. There's a lot more I could go into on that. I don't know if I'll have time. So over the last 23 years, my worldview has changed. Where I was brought up as a Midwestern kid, German Welsh ancestry, Christian background, educated in a small Midwestern high school, my knowledge base changed and enlarged because I started to hear the stories of another culture, intimate stories. My uncle, Albert, was the grandson of Chief Hollowhorn Bear, who fought at Little Bighorn. He and Crazy Horse and the others defeated Custer. So one generation removed from this active part of history, and I'm hearing the stories. I'm hearing the oral histories of this. And I'm hearing the other side. This prompted me, even early, I've always been kind of inquisitive academically. Even earlier, I started my own investigation about the different way that history is reported. Churchill is credited with saying that history is written by the victors, and that we see that is pretty much true. But there are other histories, other stories out there that tell a completely different side and flesh out why things have happened like they have. And so I've had the intimate opportunity to get this through the first person recounting of this oral history. And so in Western paradigmatic thought, man is the apex of creation. This is also a part of Christian theology. In Genesis, the creation story, man, you will have dominion. That actual verbiage is in there. So in Western paradigmatic thought, based on Christian theology, the world is a triangle, and genderizing, people, humans are at the apex. And everything else is we're on top of. Indigenous worldviews is a circle. And we as human beings are in the middle of that with everything else. If you have ever, none of us, we consider ourselves to be the top of the food chain, and we can control natures with our tools and assets and weapons. If you are ever in an instance where you are not the top of the food chain anymore, and here's an example, either a shark or a grizzly bear. If you're scuba diving in the ocean, you are food. If you're up in Yellowstone National Park or any place where there's grizzly bears, you are food. If you do not have the weapons or tools or assets to defend yourself, you then become food if you don't play your cards right. That will give you a new perspective on life. You're no longer dominant. You're no longer in dominion. You are the same as that squirrel or rabbit or anything. You're food one day and you're poop the next. So it's really imperative when we learn of things from other cultures and their culture and their particular worldview is to understand why those things happen and how they affect us. And so through the intervening these 23 years, my spiritual life, even though my underpinnings were Christianity, I have moved away from that. My spiritual beliefs and worldview is an indigenous worldview where we're all part of the same creation. And this is a fact. Now, when we think about indigeneity, we think most apart about Indians, American Indians, specifically Plains Indians, because they are what have been portrayed most in movies and books and stories, where we get a lot of our erroneous information from. By the way, the story of Pocahontas by Disney, it's false, completely false. Lost my train of thought. So we understand indigeneity kind of through the window of American Indians, but all of our ancestors, every one of us, came from an indigenous background, where we lived like American Indians did, where you're maybe nomadic or you're depending upon hunting and gathering for your food. You have to understand the nuances of creation and the weather and all that to survive. All of our ancestors at some point were there. But American Indians were somewhat the last vestige of that. There are still some left in New Guinea and parts of South America that are still indigenous, that have not they still live that way. So we all have that background. We just throughout what we call the civilization of the globe, civilizing of the globe, have turned away from that or moved beyond that, or however you want to term that. But it is still a valid worldview, and it's one that I ascribe to. And so the way that I look at spirituality, how I relate to creation, the way I pray, the language, the concepts that I use to think about things are Lakota. And so I have reached a point where I not only identify or can identify another culture, or I can begin to understand some ideas of theirs, or I have some assimilation with them. I have fully adopted and adapted a different worldview than my own genesis. So when earlier I said talking about race, I don't know how many of you have education or training in this. Race is a social construct. Race was created in order to create people, in order to create differences, to say others are different from us. Biologically, other than gender, sexual organ differences, biologically we are all the same. Genetically we are different, hence hair type, color, eye color, skin color, height, width, hand size, all that. That is genetics. Okay, it's a part of biology, but it's not biology. So race is a construct. And so I no longer identify as white, because white doesn't mean anything to me, because this is not white. That's white. This isn't. All right? And I'm also not Caucasian, because my ancestors did not come from the Caucasus. They came from Wales and Germany. So when you get that form and says check the box of your race, I always check other. And I'm not trying to be a rebel, it's just I can't identify as a white man. So culturally, I also identify as Lakota. Now when I was adopted, it did not make me an Indian. It made me part of a Lakota family. It was my immersion and my adopting the worldview and the culture and the ceremonies and all that that has made me Lakota. And so I don't identify ethnically as European, other than that is where my ancestors came from. Now this can also cause problems. If you've heard of misappropriation, cultural misappropriation. All right, a story that came out a couple of years ago, Rachel DeZiel. She was the executive director of the NAACP in the Northwest region. And she passed as a black woman, a light-skinned black woman. Okay, she was white. Now, there's a difference. I don't say that I'm Indian. I was not born an Indian. I am a member of the Lakota culture. I don't seek favors or positions or any scholarships or anything identifying as Indian. Rachel DeZiel got her position because she identified as a black woman. So there's a fine line there. I don't seek any compensation or any favor by what I'm doing. It's what makes sense to me in my current life. So my culture of origin, it doesn't really inform my worldview now. One of the things that I brought up earlier in the first class is that Lakota first speakers, a speaker of any language, who is also part of an English speaking culture, in order to communicate with English, first you have to conceptualize in the language that was your original language. Because language comes from culture, which comes from cultural concepts, which comes from lived experience. And so first I have to, my Lakota relatives who speak Lakota first they have to think in Lakota. Then they have to translate it into English, and then they have to make sure that their use of the English language fits the culture or the cultural ideas that they're trying to communicate. That is beginning to happen for me. I'm thinking in a different way now and having to somewhat translate it. And in some level, I'm not a fluent Lakota speaker. I can speak ceremonial language. I can understand a lot of conversation. I can understand a lot of written text. But I could not start speaking to you in Lakota now and have it make any sense. I tell the story that there's nothing. One great thing that I've learned in my life is humility. not to be humiliated, but humility, to understand your place and your importance, and how to be kind of egalitarian and realize that everyone is valued, everyone is important. Living in a culture as a minority, as like the only white guy in the room, really, really helps you to understand humility and understand who and how you are. And so the story I share is sitting at the table with all the old men drinking coffee, the Lakota men, and they're chatting in Lakota, and I'm catching a word here and there. And all of a sudden a man says something and everybody laughs. And then they all look at me. So I realize that they're talking about me, but I don't understand. And if you think as educators, you're talking about a multicultural classroom, and you have students that are coming from cultural backgrounds that are unlike your own, they're going to be like me sitting at that table. They're going to know that communication is happening. They're going to know that something's transpiring. But until it's directly pointed towards them, they're not going to really have an understanding. And they still are not going to understand unless somebody explains it to them. And so the Lakota men, on occasion, they would explain what the joke was or something. So this is, you're going to run into this. No matter where you teach, unless your classroom is homogenized and they're all the same from all the same region, backgrounds, cultures, and all that, you're going to have to learn to differentiate and pay attention to the differences that come out. Beth, anything? That was a little shorter version, so.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the significance of being adopted?
Okay. So, as I said, in Lakota culture, relationships are the most important things. And for me, I had been going out there for over nearly 15 years, and it was a winter day. I remember sitting in my truck. It was Albert and my now sister Emily. We're going to go somewhere. We're talking about a ceremony that's going to be happening in the summer. And Albert looked at me. He says, "After that ceremony, we're going to bring you into the family. We're going to adopt you." And I mean, it just basically made my heart burst, because that is one of the highest honors that you could have. Now, it doesn't ascribe any special privilege to me whatsoever. It just means I'm related to them. So they made an intentional act to bring me in as a relative and recognize me as a relative and call me uncle, nephew, brother, and then I can call them the same, familial relationship language as well. I also had to accept this offer, which I readily did because I understood. Because having over 15 years, having slowly morphed out of who I was, I needed some place to go with that. And this provided me a place culturally to identify. Is that kind of what you were?
So there wasn't any legal aspect, really?
No, now hold on. It is legal. In Lakota culture, I am legally adopted. In Western paradigm of adoption, I am not, because there's no paperwork, no judge signed off on it. They are both equally binding. One in this culture, one in this culture. Or one in Lakota culture and one in this culture. So, among the Lakota, I'm a family member. In white culture or whatever, they would not recognize that this man or these people that I have any legal standing with them. But that doesn't matter, because the cultural standing is what matters for the Lakota in this particular instance. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So are your kids part of the Lakota culture then?
They have not been in the experience with me. My children are probably older than anybody in here. My children are 32 and 34. Sorry. Yay! I did introduce my son to some ceremonies, but he didn't want any part of it. If they were to come in and want to intentionally be a part of the experience, then I would slowly acclimate them to and help them assimilate into it. But they are choosing not to. So there's no requirement for them to be a part of that.
So then,
Oh, I'm sorry, he had his hand up first.
The latest one.
Okay.
would they then have to be like adopted for them to be recognized?
They could be.
Your relative or their
They could be. I have there's a woman I know who's my sister, she's also white, who was adopted by the same family.
Oh.
Okay, so she was adopted as a sister to one of my Indian sisters. Okay, automatically her son became a grandson. Okay, or a niece or a nephew. So, you know, because he grew up in the culture.
Okay.
He grew up traveling to South Dakota with his mom and being part of all the ceremonies.
You mentioned the fact that initially you started out in the Lutheran
Yep.
church,
Yep.
but something drew you away.
Yep.
Was it the connection to the Native Americans' way of doing things that pulled you away from your Christianity or Christian-minded mind?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Eventually, that's where I wound up because there's something about the American Indian, the Lakota culture that drew me in. But my leaving the Lutheran religion had to do with my not believing that. Okay, Lutherans broke off from Catholicism back in the 1600s, 1400s, when did Luther do that? Anyway, so growing up in the Lutheran church, there's a Stenorian pastor, and he said that Catholics were going to hell. Well, my best friend, Jimmy Bloom, was Catholic. So at 7, already I was like, no, this doesn't make any sense to me, because Jimmy Bloom's not going to hell if I'm not going to hell. So that's kind of what drove me away from that, and this is just a personal opinion on the Lutheran religion. I've been given the cutoff sign. Thanks for your time. If there's anything, anytime if you want to contact me, if there's any more information that you would want, you can get a hold of me through Dr. Sandell. And then next fall, if you're around, you need service learning hours, volunteer at the powwow. Thank you. So 9 tomorrow? 11, 9?
No, 11.
11 works, yeah.
maanta shaqa u imaateen aan umalaynaa meesha shaqa rabtiin applicationkan buuxiya warqadaha markaa buuxisiin sida ugu dhaqsiyaha badana in kusoo wacayaa si aad shaqo u heshiin shaqa raadinaysiin mahano buuxiya haddaad shaqo rabtiin taleefonkiina iyo adreyskiina ku qora si aan kala soo xiriiro oo markaas aad shaqada ugu buuxisiin shaqada buuxiya si aan shaqada inii siin marka warqadaha markaa buubuuxisiin waa inka aruurinaya marka warqadaha buubuuxiya markaa warqadaha buubuuxisiin waa ina soo wacaya markaasaad shaqo ini siina meeshaan waxaa u imaateen inaad shaqaysiin soo maa shaqa raadinaysiin shaqadii marka saa u raadin lahayseen waa inaa helaa lambarkiina iyo meesha aad ku nooshiin si aan shaqa ini siin marka waxaa inka codsanaa inaad sida ugu dhaqsiyaha badan aad u buubuuxisiin si shaqa laynkugu raadiyo aa markaas ugu dibaratiin noloshiina ilmihiina iyo gurigiinaba hadduu ilaahay ka raali noqdo marka ku dadaala saa u buubuuxi lahaysaan shaqada si shaqa layniin siiyo so shaqa ma u imaateen meesha shaqa ma rabtiin yaa shaqa rabo yaa fahmaayo luuqadaan ku hadlaayo qof fahmaa min ku jiraa luuqadaan ku hadlaayo shaqa ma rabtiina u malayna anaa ay fiirinaysiin saaka shaqa ma usoo bixin miya meeshaan dheeldheel markaa waa in la shaqeeyaa si nolosha loo dibirto marka shaqada buubuuxiya shaqada saa u buubuuxisiin si aan shaqa idiin siiyo
Buenas tardes, por favor, tienen esta aplicación si quieren trabajar lo más posible que puedan. Pásenla, por favor. Pongan todos sus datos correctos. Si se equivocan, alcen la mano y yo les doy más. Otro papel. Por ahí, pásalo, por favor.
How you feeling? when you hear the language? Do you understand?
No.
You guys have an idea what's this all about?
Introduction to different languages.
What they were talking
But
about.
in that, what do you feel when we speak?
Maybe,
Do you have a
maybe it
clue?
was some kind of, I won't call it incantation. It's more like a prayer of bringing our spirits closer to us. That's what I thought it was.
Anybody have a clue? Anybody understand what we were saying? No? You do?
Like directions.
About what?
People's messages.
About what's about? Specific, be more specific. Not sure, right? You don't feel frustrated?
No,
Still?
you can't be frustrated about life. You know, when you go to take whatever you're able to get out of it and make the best of the situation.
Mm-hmm. If you try to fill it out, if how you going to fill it out if it's not in your language?
That's a good one.
That's what we're talking about. How you feel. So you, in case you go another country, you don't speak that language, you don't understand. But live over there, you need a work, job, opportunity. You know, the home, need rent, food, clothes. And sometimes you have a children, they waiting for you. So the one thing you looking, the job. You don't know. I give you application, I told you, fill the application. Say you looking job, you address, your number, and I contact you, and I offer a job. But you don't understand me. But I say just you look at me. So how can we communicate? Or I give you job. That's the point. How the difficult when you go another country. Some reason. And you looking job opportunity, how you survive, how you pay your rent, your gas, your electric, food,